Brendan Delahunty, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam. Happy to be here, mate.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and chat to us today. For the listeners, perhaps if you can just provide a bit of a brief background on your history in Japan, some of the past roles that you've had, and your current role.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, as you obviously know, Sam, I'm an Aussie as well here in Japan. So I first came here, I think, back in 1993. So I've been here for quite a long time. I came first of all on the JET program. And then worked at a college for a couple of years after that. I then moved on to an education company called Pearson, and at the time they owned the Financial Times and Penguin Books, but Pearson was the education part of the business and still is, I think, the largest education company in the world. So I worked there for about 17 years.
Wow. Some
of that time was in Japan and some of it was in the UK, but the last role I had within Pearson was running the Pearson Education Japan office here. Excuse me. So that was a pretty interesting role, getting really heavily involved in university and high school education. But when I left, I was really interested in working in sports, and it was in the lead up to the Rugby World Cup. So I managed to find a job with STH, which is where I am now. So I'm the president of the business here. And our key role when we set up the business in 2016, 2017 was actually to set up the official hospitality program for the Rugby World Cup. Now we've got a couple of big shareholders. In the UK, we've got STH UK, who are backed by a large French multinational called Sodexo. But the big partner that we have here in Japan is JTB, who I'm sure most people know very well. They're a 49% shareholder in our business.
Flag wavers.
Yes, that's right.
You don't do any of that yourself. You don't lead tour groups around.
Well, I'll come on to that in a minute.
Okay, cool. And sorry, just before you go on, Brendan, just to clarify, the STH stands for.
STH stands for Sports, Travel, and Hospitality.
Yeah.
So STH in the UK has been running for probably the last 4 Rugby World Cups. We've done the Rugby World Cups in New Zealand, France, England, and here in Japan. And Sodexo, I think, was actually involved in the one in Australia as well. Mm. So our job was to actually set up the hospitality program here in Japan. And it was quite tough because, you know, as a lot of people know, the venues and the stadiums in Japan are not really set up in the same way as they're overseas. So the types of corporate boxes and things that you would expect to see with kitchens and all the equipment you need to run hospitality don't really exist in this country in most of the stadiums. Mm. So we had to find different interesting ways to run that. What we have done in the past, what we did here was to build a temporary structure at Yokohama. And we hosted, I guess, about 1,600 people for all the games that were in Yokohama during the Rugby World Cup, including the semi-finals and the finals. And that was a massive success for us. And we weren't quite sure at the beginning how it was going to work out, but we did find that Japanese customers seem to love sports hospitality. So
really,
as part of that process, we decided to apply for the hospitality program at the Olympics, and so we are involved in that, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the other stuff that we started to look at is running a travel business as well. So we've got a Class 1 travel license now, and obviously with the support of JTB, that's really helpful in terms of setting up a travel program. So the first one that we're going to be doing is the Rugby World Cup in 2023, and that's where my flag waving experience will start to come to the fore. We just released some packages for that, but we're also looking at doing hospitality or being a sales agent for hospitality in F1 in Suzuka this year. We've got some links with baseball that should be coming up soon. So we started to branch out really, and that was the point of the business here, was to get set up with the Rugby World Cup to see where else we could go with that. And the main one that we're working on at the moment, we're working with TOCOG as the official hospitality office. So similar to Rugby World Cup, there is official in-venue hospitality at many of the events that are going on, and particularly around aquatics, athletics and golf, where we're building temporary structures. Those are the really big ones, but at some of the smaller venues too, there'll be hospitality at the venues that customers can come along, they can enjoy the games, and then they can experience hospitality packages as well, which usually includes food, beverage, some form of experience or entertainment, things like guest speakers, etc., etc. So that's what we do as part of our business here in STH.
Yeah, very cool, very cool.
Yeah.
And are there things that you've sort of learnt and picked up from your experience with the Rugby World Cup that you've sort of been able to implement into the planning of what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, I think we had quite a few operators come in from overseas, and one of the big learnings was about the building laws here in Japan around temporary structures.
Right.
Obviously, it's not quite as easy to get planning permissions, etc., passed here in Japan because the laws are more stringent given the earthquake scenario here. Land and space is difficult. And I think the biggest learning that we had was that unexpectedly, it was very difficult to find people to help fit out and do the catering for large numbers of hospitality customers. So, at Yokohama, we were doing 1,600 people a day. They were sit-down meals, 4 or 5 courses in some cases, and to find a caterer that was able to do that away from from their usual venue was quite difficult. We built up a good relationship with Hilton, and they've worked with us very closely, both at Rugby World Cup, and they're going to be working with us at the Olympics as well. So happy to have them on board and working with us on that particular issue and taking, the standard of stadium food that you would normally get up to a completely different level here.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, the Olympics that are going to go ahead this year is going to be very different to what we've experienced in the past. And there's obviously a lot of uncertainty with exactly how that's going to play out. And between now and July, there's obviously a lot of things that can change. And I understand that the parties involved are not necessarily, revealing all the information that is going on. But from your understanding, what sort of form are the Olympics going to take in
2021? I think it's a really good question because the uncertainty means that decision making is being pushed back as late as possible, and to be honest, we don't have access to those types of decisions either until, probably pretty much just before the public does. We might get a day or two notice beforehand.
Right.
Although we do tend to follow the news a bit more closely, so we track what we can that way. Now, looking at the latest reports coming out of news agencies like the Nikkei, they have been talking about the fact that the Tokyo Metropolitan Governor, Koike-san, is looking, or she has mentioned that 50% social distancing in stadiums would be a reasonable amount of social distancing to expect. Now, we don't know under what circumstances that might be implemented, so that could be the decision that they go with. They might decide to wait a little bit and see how the COVID cases are progressing in Tokyo. We don't know whether that means that in some venues that are indoor, so table tennis, for example, where you don't get as much ventilation, they may increase the social distancing percentage. But at a stadium where you have more, obviously, outdoor ventilation, they may decrease that social distancing percentage. So that's all to come. Now, the decision is supposed to happen around about the end of April. I know that some members of the various organisations involved, including the IOC, are keen to see that delayed a little bit so that they can look at the latest situation just before the games. That does have complications and implications then for ticketing, because obviously you've got to think about, you've got millions of potential customers coming along to these games, and then what does that mean if you have to stop or prevent some of them coming? How do you go about that, or how do you, release general public tickets later on? So there's all sorts of ongoing implications from that actual decision. So the games themselves are going to be very different, I think, from what you normally expect. They'll be probably much quieter, as the the authorities here have been requesting people to not cheer and to not make loud noises when they're spectating. I'm not sure if eating and drinking is going to be allowed in the stadiums, to encourage people to wear masks all the time.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of things that will be different about these games. And I think 2 years ago we would have thought this would have been a disaster to have this, but given the fact that the games might go ahead or are likely to go ahead, just the ability of the organising committee to put something on and get it out there and run an Olympic Games under these conditions is going to be pretty remarkable, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And do you know anything about sort of the ticketing and whether people who have purchased tickets in the ballot a couple of years ago, whether they'll actually be entitled to those tickets? Obviously, it will depend on the capacity of the stadiums and things like that. But do you have any sort of intel into how that'll work? Or?
To be honest, not really. What we do know is that overseas spectators are obviously not allowed, as it's been in the news. I think the way that will happen is obviously through the visa restrictions to stop people getting into the country. So there's quite a few 100,000 of those tickets that will become available. And there was a refund process that was run last year where obviously people who decided that they didn't want to go could hand their tickets back in. So a number of tickets have already been handed back to the organising committee. I don't know if that's enough to cover the social distancing guidelines that they will put in place, and whether more people then have to lose their right to go to the games, and how the organising committee will actually run that process. To be honest, I can imagine for the ticketing team it's a complete headache to try and figure out how you separate different groups of people, how you set up the stadium. So do you set it that people can sit together in groups of 10 or 15 if they all know each other?
Yeah.
Or if every single person has to sit with an empty seat around them. So depending on which scenario they choose, you could have more or less people in the stadiums and the venues. Our office here is in Guyan Maya, and we sit opposite the Yakult Swallows baseball stadium. From what we can see, they tend to go for smaller groups sitting together. So you could have 5 to 10 people all bunched together if they know each other. They come as a group, and then there'll be some spacing between them, and that generally tends to fill more of the stadium. It gives the stadium more opportunities to sell more seats.
Yep.
So all of those things will come into play at some stage. TOCOG is working with the Metropolitan Government to come up with what they call playbooks, which are rules and guidelines about how to deal with the COVID situation here, going through security checks. Obviously, social distancing is going to become more important because that's where you'll get a bottleneck of people, how people behave around the stadium itself, getting in and out of the stadium, on the concourses. All of these things will have guidelines that will be different from usual. So I think we really do have to wait and see what those social distancing instructions are from the Metropolitan Government before we'll have a clear idea about how that will impact then on people's tickets and ability to go to the games in July and August.
And for your side of the business, how is that impacting you? And did you have several plans or several sort of protocols based on how those social distance requirements change, or how are you sort of structuring things at the moment?
Yeah, it's obviously made things a lot more complicated for us.
I can imagine.
So we need to think about how people sit in the structures that we build and try to figure out how we can operate within those playbook guidelines that TOCOG are putting out. We've also had to look at the way that restaurants and other areas here are operating with those types of perspex dividers that you often see in hotels and restaurants here now, while also maintaining the air of exclusivity, I guess, that hospitality is supposed to generate. So There's quite a bit about that. We need to look at how we serve people. Generally speaking, we're looking at much more at single serve plates rather than using buffets, for example,
Yep.
where possible. So these types of things are the types of considerations that we've had to look at and make changes. And it does complicate the process, because it's just another thing on top of quite a difficult organisation anyway.
Yeah.
To provide a hospitality program, when you have to then add this layer of additional measures on top, it hasn't been easy for our ops team. So they've done a great job in figuring out ways to operate within these conditions.
Yeah, yeah.
I think the other thing that hasn't helped us is given the fact that Tokyo and Japan as a whole is pretty much locked down to overseas visitors at the moment. Generally speaking, as we get closer to the games, we get more staff in to help out. So as the venues are built, we need venue managers and assistant venue managers. So Japan's lack of experience in hospitality means that we need to normally go overseas to bring people in.
Right.
But we can't get them in at the moment. So
right.
we've got all sorts of complications going on there. We've got a couple of people who are in quarantine at the moment in one of those tiny business hotels that they have. Conditions are not pleasant, so that's a turn off then for people who are coming in as well. So
yeah. But you have been able to. I mean, obviously, the pool is not going to be as great. And it's more difficult to bring people over, but you are actually able to bring people from overseas.
We've managed to get a few people in, but the process is very complicated. And it's a turn off actually. If you're sitting overseas and you're coming in for a couple of months, you have to spend 2 weeks in a tiny hotel room. These are literally 10 or 11 square meters before you can then begin working again.
Yeah.
That's sort of big incentive to want to show up and come to the games here. So some people are saying, yes, we'll put up with it, because the experience of working on the games is, it's a fairly unique one, and a lot of people will want to have that on their CVs. Sure. Other people are looking at this and saying, happy to wait till Paris and things will be better over there.
So I guess this, in some areas, there's a little bit of a negative sentiment about the Olympics just being, very different from what we would expect. And there's some people saying that, maybe it shouldn't go ahead. What are the real big positives that you can see at the moment? And what are the things that you're excited about with having the event going ahead?
Well, you're right. I think the sentiment, and you can see in the polling that the Japanese people at the moment are, quite against to having the games here. The majority of people. Although, to be honest, I think in the build-up to the Olympics, you often find that there's a lot of negative feedback towards the games. So it happened in London. It happens everywhere. That in the months before the games are held, people are generally split between having them and not having them, because there's such a cost involved in having the games. There's a lot of disruption to the city, so it causes all sorts of problems. And generally speaking, in the lead up to any games, there's always a lot of negativity. That tends to change as you get closer and closer to the games, and people start to get excited about having international spectators come in, having all these famous sports stars come in, seeing records broken, all these types of things. Now that's starting to happen here in Japan as well. Now the big news over the past couple of weeks has been some of the stuff that's happening with the Japanese sports stars. So you've got that Japanese swimmer Ike-san, who has recovered from leukemia and come back to qualify for the Olympic Games, and that type of overcoming hardship story goes down so well here. And I think a lot of people are now starting to think, well, they'd love to see her compete in the games and hopefully win a medal, because her backstory is so emotional, I guess.
Inspiring.
And then you have someone like Hideki Murayama, who's just won the Masters in the US. He'll be competing at the golf in his home Olympics. So there's going to be a lot of interest in him. There's talk of him potentially being the person who might light the Olympic cauldron at the opening ceremony. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. we've got the torch relay going on at the moment, and even though that's also kind of being changed a little bit because of the COVID conditions, as that touches different parts of Japan, people start to realise that the games are happening, they are going on. So there's a lot more interest, and we're starting to see the mood too with our customers start to change. At the beginning of the year, nobody was interested in talking about hospitality and bringing guests, but particularly over the last couple of weeks, as these stories have started to filter out, we're starting to see a significant uptick in the tickets that we're able to sell, or packages that we're able to sell, because, as I mentioned before, general public tickets may not go back on sale. So the only way really to get into the games now is through hospitality. So we're seeing corporations and businesses and even individuals coming to us and saying, well, what have you got, and how can we get some access into some of these events at aquatics, at a golf, the opening ceremony, closing ceremony, 100-meter finals is always a big one. So for us too, we're starting to see a change in sentiment just in the way that people are reacting to our salespeople.
Yeah. And how many sort of text messages do you personally expect to receive as it gets closer to the event? Hey, Brendo, have you got any tickets for tonight's event? Surely that's...
If the Rugby World Cup is any indication, the phone will have to go onto silent mode for a while.
Yeah,
it's quite difficult, you know. I mean, our contract specifically says we can't sell tickets separately. We have to sell them as part of the hospitality packages. So it's a difficult thing to be able to say to people. We do have tickets. We do have to purchase them as part of a package.
Yeah.
We have a handback process where a few weeks before the games start, we do a final handback of what we think we won't need in terms of tickets. Now, normally that would go back onto general public sale. I don't think that will happen in this particular case if the social distancing guidelines are around about 50 or 60%. But you never know. There may be a late flurry of tickets on the market, just as if the organising committee for some reason decides to change those guidelines at a very late stage. So there's always hope, but yeah, it's difficult as you get closer and closer to the games. Those tickets become rarer and rarer, and we've just put out a special package on the opening ceremony. It's about 100 days to go, I think, from yesterday to the opening ceremony. So there was a special deal for opening ceremony by itself. 100 packages open to the market, and we've had a lot of phone calls about that already yesterday and today. So we'll be putting more of those things out to the market over the next few weeks, as we have the 100 days to go to the 100-meter final, 100 days to go to the closing ceremony, etc.
Yeah. Okay. And I guess
I know you'll be hitting me up for tickets, though.
Yeah, for sure. I guess, and so starting to wrap up, if people or companies are looking to purchase some of those packages, how can they find you? What's the best place to go there?
The best thing to do is they're on the Tokyo 2020 website. There is an official hospitality section, and actually, if I just look at the website itself, it's just called official hospitality at tokyo2020.org. The best thing to do is go on there. People can have a look at packages, and they can decide if they want to go along and enjoy some of the hospitality. They register, and once they've registered, then one of our salespeople will contact them directly to make sure that they can have a discussion about what they want, and we can try and find the best solution in their budget, their dates, etc., to help them get along to those games. Yeah.
And then just mention the code Legend Brendan, and you get an extra 25% off. Is that right?
That might work. We'll have to have a look at that.
All right. Well, as I said, we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule and coming on today, Brendan. Is there any other sort of thoughts on the Olympics or anything that you'd sort of like to close with today?
Yeah, I just think, I think it's going to be a really special occasion. It's probably going to be a much more emotional Olympics than previous ones, because as Thomas Bach, the head of the IOC, has come out and said, they want to use this as a way of the world starting to emerge from the COVID crisis. You're going to hear a lot of stories about people and athletes, training, how they've overcome these situations. I'm sure there'll be lots of emotional stories about people having lost family members, etc., etc. So I suspect that this will be quite an emotional Olympics in many ways, as a lot of those backstories start to come out about the athletes. And if possible, if you've got tickets already and you're thinking about whether or not to go, I'd highly recommend hanging on to it as much as possible, and trying to get there, because even though they'll be different and slightly strange and won't be the same experience as normal, it's the one Olympics that people will refer back to as being completely and utterly different from any other Olympics that's taken place in history. So it's definitely worthwhile if you've got those tickets already. Don't give them up. Make sure that you try and get there and be part of it.
Yeah. All right, I'm feeling emotional just hearing that. I'm starting to get goosebumps. All right, well, thanks again, Brendan. I mean, if things sort of change and there's new sort of developments coming on, or if you want to talk about other sort of aspects of the business, we'd love to have you back again in the future. But thanks again for today.
I was going to say, we'll hear a lot more towards the end of April, beginning of May. So perhaps the end of May might be a good time to come back and do an update.
Sounds good. All right, thanks, Brendan. Take care. Have a good day.
Talk to you later. Bye.